Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's been such a fun morning so far. I hope everyone feels the same and has enjoyed the program so far and found lots of fun tips and tricks to take home with you. So my name is Meredith Meyer. I'm the associate editor here at BizTimes Milwaukee. I'm also a reporter, and I cover a number of different things, including entertainment, restaurants, retail, hospitality, and tourism. And I'm also the moderator of today's discussion with award-winning investigative reporter Meg Kissinger. So yeah, we'll be talking about Meg's 2023 memoir, While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence. It's right here for display. But beyond the book, we're going to hopefully leave you with some new and additional insights on mental illness and how it impacts individuals, families, communities, systems, and also why breaking the silence around the issue is so important. So before I let Meg start telling us her story, just a couple more words on her and her illustrious career. So Meg Kissinger is a Pulitzer Prize finalist who spent more than 2 decades traveling across the country, writing about mental illness and America's broken mental health care system for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Her reporting spurred changes to Wisconsin law and led to the creation of more than 600 new housing units in Milwaukee for people with chronic mental illness. So Meg has spent the latter part of her career shaping and empowering the next generation of journalists as a visiting professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and at her alma mater, DePauw University. And she's currently a trainer for Columbia's Dart Center on Trauma and Journalism. And then last year, Meg published what perhaps could be her most comprehensive and personal story yet, one that intimately documents her own family struggles with mental illness, which of course is the memoir I mentioned. And yeah, just really looking to hearing more about it. Do you have anything you want to say before I answer?
No, you did a great job.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. No, it's wonderful.
Okay.
I'm just very happy to be with you.
Great. Okay, so again, thank you for being here and also sharing your family's story. We just had a conversation out in the lobby before we started here about vulnerability, and you pretty much undertook the most vulnerable project of your life with this book. And so I give you props, and I know also a big purpose of doing that for you was to allow others to relate and have the power to share their experiences and to just raise awareness in general about mental illness and the importance of effective mental health treatment. So I'd like to start, though, by giving everyone a little bit more context for the book. Not everyone has read it, but you all should, honestly. It's so good. So what were some of the events that led up to you making this decision to write a book? You spent years on it, and it definitely shows. And yeah, so just a little bit of background on your family and
Sure.
even like your reporting work that contributed and compelled you to write.
Yeah, thank you for that, Meredith. Yeah. So I began at the Milwaukee Journal in 1983, which was my third newspaper job, so I am an old lady. But this book was, truly my labor of love. And as Meredith mentioned, I come from a family. I'm the fourth of 8 kids. I was born in Chicago, although my parents are both from Milwaukee, but they moved to Chicago before I was born. Just as life has it, my family was full of a lot of love and charming and have many happy memories, but sprinkled in there too were some great sorrows. And as is true in almost every family, in fact, I think I will say emphatically, I've yet to meet a family that doesn't have some measure of mental illness from within. But it was just, I happened to grow up in a time when we didn't have the words for that. and we didn't know how to speak about that. So when I came downstairs one morning when I was 6 years old and couldn't find my mother and didn't know where she was, I looked all over the house for her, and I would later learn that she was being hospitalized for postpartum depression. But of course nobody said those words. We didn't talk about postpartum depression. And my grandmother just shooed me away and said, "Tell him she's got pneumonia." So I was always curious, and I was just born a curious kid, and I think we were in the middle of a big family. We've got a lot of good material to poke around and find out about. So it was very lucky for me that I got to spend my career as a reporter and asking questions. And it was through my journalism that I could kind of scratch that itch, that curiosity. So as you'll find if you read the book, or I'll just tell you, spoiler alert. So I had a sister who died when I was going into my senior year of college. My sister Nancy died by suicide. And again, no discussion about that in our family, except for my father to call us all into the living room on the night that she died to say, if anybody asks, this was an accident. And he wasn't trying to be mean. He was just overwhelmed and scared and I'm sure ashamed, which is too bad because he had nothing to be ashamed about. Mental illness is not anything anybody chooses to have, and it's not a result of bad parenting. Anyway, we didn't know that in those days, so we didn't talk about it, and off we went. This is a long-winded way of saying that my life experience, my family experience, engendered in me that great curiosity about what people who are living with serious mental illness go through and how we can get care for them. So fast forward many years later, my brother Danny, who also struggled with mental illness, he also died by suicide. So when I lost a second sibling to that manner of death, I kind of felt like, you know what, this is just a scandal of tremendous proportion. And so the reporter in me knew that I had a hell of a story to tell about why can't we do better, why can't we find ways to care for people with mental illness with the same enthusiasm and the same curiosity that we do for illnesses like cancer or heart disease. So lucky me that I was working at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel for a fantastic editor who shared my vision for following that as a scandal and as a story worthy of telling. And I just knew, after Danny died, I wrote a story that appeared in the Journal on a Sunday, and it got a lot of attention, and my mailbox in the newsroom was overflowing. And I got all kinds of letters and outreach from people saying, we're struggling in our family too, and we don't know where to turn. And they were desperate for...
What year was that?
That was in 1998 that the story appeared. Danny died in 97, and it took me a year to kind of muster up the energy to write about that. And I knew then that I just had a really compelling story to tell. And I found, with no small amount of irony, that I could ask total strangers these very intimate questions that I didn't have really the courage to ask my brothers and the people that I love the most, the people in my families. So that then that led me to 25 years out on the trail, going all over the country and asking people two questions. Why do we treat people with mental illness differently than those struggling with other illnesses, and what can we do about it? And so that kept me very busy. It kept me hopping for 25 years. And it was when I then was asked to go and teach an investigative reporting class in New York City at Columbia University. So then I had motive and opportunity to write a book, because I thought these stories are important to tell in a daily newspaper, but I wanted something a little heftier that could put it all together. Yeah, so that was a long way of saying it took me a hell of a long time to write this book.
Yes, incredible process there. So my next question is kind of the culture of silence and shame is such a focal point of the book. I mean, it's one thing to, you know, be part of a family that has had so many struggles and tragedy, but the part that really, it seemed, affected you all most was the fact that it just wasn't talked about, and you didn't talk about it as siblings or as a family unit. But, you know, over the years there has been a bit of a culture shift. Mental illness and mental health is a buzzword today, which maybe you never expected that to happen, you know, back in the 80s or 90s, in the throw of things. So that is, I guess, good news. And I want to know, I guess, how is that culture shift, how has that, you know, impacted the way you've been able to publish this book? How has it even impacted your family now? I know that you and your siblings have children. There's, you know, the next generation of your family. And in the book, I know you talked about, you know, some of your nieces and nephews, and, you know, even your children have struggled with anxiety and other kind of issues, mental health issues.
Right.
But it's a different arena now. You're able to talk about it as a
It
family.
is, yeah.
So what has that been like?
Yeah, I like your honing in on a matter of shame, because when I set about to write this book, and it was just burning inside of me, like I really wanted to tell my family story. For one thing, we're adorable and very lovable and very funny and fun to be with. And I thought, you know, that's not the notion, or that's not the picture that people have when you think of somebody with serious mental illness. You think of somebody frightening or scary or off-putting. And, you know, don't get me wrong, people in the throes of very serious mental illness can look like that, but that's not who they are. They are a human being, and they are loved. Somebody loves those people. And I certainly did love my brother and sister who died. I loved everybody in my family. So I wanted people to know about my family, and I wanted to break that myth that people with mental illness are scary and unlovable. And so I also knew that shame that surrounds mental illness is toxic. Nothing good comes from being ashamed. And so when I told you that story about my dad, you know, calling us all into the living room, he was ashamed. And that was the culture that he grew up in, you know, so he was a product of the 1930s and 40s, and they certainly didn't talk about anything in those days. And, you know, it's funny because around the dinner table at my house, we talked about everything. I mean, it's usually about, you know, who had a crush on who, and, you know, what nun was the meanest, had the toughest jabs in the classroom. You know, I mean, we talked about a lot of things, but we didn't talk about when we were starting to feel depressed or anxious or scared. And so I'm very glad that we are finding ways to talk about these things now. And when I took a class on how to write this book, and it was a fantastic class by a woman named Marion Roach Smith. So any of you out there who are going to write your memoir, and I hope that you do, because everybody has a compelling story to tell. Anyway, she said the first piece of advice was, your memoir is not about you. And I was like, what? It most certainly is. I'm very interested. She's like, nope. First of all, nobody knows who you are, or like maybe 5 people do, but they're not going to buy a book because you wrote a book. They want to know something that's going to help them. They want to know how they can live their life better, or what insights they can get into their lives because of something that you went through. So something that I knew that I went through was, you know, the pain of losing people to an illness that we couldn't talk about. So then the second thing she said was, come up with a very clear argument. So what are you making? What argument is your book making? And so that's my argument. My argument is that shame is toxic. So let's figure out a way to talk about mental illness that strips away that shame. Because as I said earlier, mental illness is nothing anybody wants. Nobody willfully chooses to have mental illness. It's thrust upon you, and it can be quite torturous. So let's find ways to speak compassionately and to love in a fuller way and get them the help that they need. So just a quick, nerdy little semantic lesson that I have come up with that I've stolen from a guy by the name of Thomas Insel, I-N-S-E-L. He was the director of the National Institute on Mental Health. And he said, one of my favorite quotes, he said, there are two kinds of families, those with mental illness and those who don't have mental illness yet. So, in other words, we're all going to be touched by this. We all are touched by this. So let's find a way to talk about this and to have these conversations with people who are suffering and find ways to give them a chance to let us know what they need. So, right the week before my brother Danny died, he wrote me a letter, and I was like, whoa, this dude never wrote me anything. I mean, like not a thank you note, which he should have, not a happy birthday card, not like congratulations on your new baby, nothing. So when a letter from Danny showed up in the mail, I was like, what's going on here? And what it was he was finally coming to grips with the fact that he was profoundly mentally ill, that he had bipolar that was causing him to act erratically and to do and say things that were hurtful. And Danny had denied that. I mean, we all knew that for years, but he was never willing to acknowledge that or not able to acknowledge that. And for some reason, probably because of some new medication that he finally went on, he was able to look at his life clearly, and he was reaching out to apologize. I got very worried when I saw that because that's a sign of somebody very vulnerable to suicide. And I looked at it like this might be a suicide note. I was very worried when I got it. But what he said in that note was so beautiful. And he said, it's a terrible thing to live with mental illness, and it causes you to say and do the most awkward things. But what is helpful is if we could find a way to love and understand those who suffer. So I was like, whoa. Anyway, the next week he did die. And after he died, I wrote those words down on an index card, and I taped them to the side of my computer in the newsroom at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And that was my battle cry. And I decided, well, that's what we need to do. Let's go out and find ways to learn how to love people with mental illness and try to understand them.
I love that. We actually have great synergy because I literally had written down that exact quote for my next question. And I think the direct quote was, only love and understanding can conquer this disease. Is that right? So I'm wondering, so you applied that approach and that framework to your work, with the Journal Sentinel and traveling across the country, covering the conditions in which people with mental illness live. And then obviously in writing this book, you applied that framework. How can we all do the same in our lives? Kind of taking that need for love and understanding of people that are directly suffering with mental illness, or people that have family members or close friends suffering from mental illness. And that can apply to coworkers as well. This is obviously a business conference, so how can we even bring that attitude into the places in which we work?
Yeah, I love that question, Meredith. Thank you for that. So I interrupted myself, which I do all the time, and I was starting to say that the difference between talking about the stigma of mental illness, we hear that a lot, right? Anytime somebody's talking about mental illness, they talk about the stigma of mental illness. I don't like that word because stigma means stigmata. So it literally means like the markings that Christ had, in hands and feet and head. So what that suggests when you talk, and I know it's well-intentioned, but when you talk about people living with the stigma of mental illness, the implication I get from that is that they are stained in some way, and the onus, or whatever, the focus is on the person living with mental illness. I like to do what Tom Insel talked about and refer to or focus on how we discriminate against people with mental illness. So people who are living with bipolar or schizophrenia or severe depression, those are people who are often, their rights are denied them. They often can't find anybody to employ them or rent to them. Insurance companies are very quick to deny coverage. So your excellent question about what we can do to better love and understand is to take time. So it's, it sounds kind of woo-woo, it sounds kind of squishy, but it's really not. It really does start. Danny actually had the perfect algorithm, the way that we need to make time to understand the person and to look at the person as a human being. So not when we're walking down the street. Before earphones came out, you always knew who had schizophrenia because they were the dudes walking down the street talking to themselves. Now it's just anybody because they're talking on the phone to their cousin or something. But anyway, so instead of looking away, look toward them and have a conversation and ask them how you can help them. It's not easy, and people who are in pain often can be mean. And my sister Nancy certainly was very mean to me. You'll learn from the book. She would occasionally chase me around the house, sometimes with a knife. So I don't want to sugarcoat like it's all just love and flowers and rainbows. The reality of living with somebody with serious mental illness is a tough one, and there's a lot of heartbreak, and there's a lot of disappointment, and there's some fear. So, yeah, what we can do is to, I think, again, first and foremost, look at them as human beings, find ways to engage with them, and find out how they're feeling, what they need. We talk a lot about how this is the no casserole disease. If you had another form of illness, people would be flocking to you. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2006. I was so mad because I was killing it at work. I was writing one story after another about what a crummy job Milwaukee was doing in providing decent housing for people with serious mental illness. And when I got that diagnosis, I was like, nope, I do not have time to have cancer. Thank you very much. But, like hard pass. But they're like, too bad, you have to go through chemo and radiation. So I did. And guess what? People could not have been nicer to me. They knit me a hat because I was bald, and they, gave me a little cloth bag for my medical records. I called it my tit kit. They were just so accommodating, and they said, we're going to give you somebody called your journey coordinator who can take you to your appointments and coordinate. And I was like, what? Thank you so much. I don't need that because I have this awesome husband and these great kids. But you know who does need a journey coordinator? The people that I'm writing about every day. The people who are living out on the streets that nobody wants to look at or talk to. They need journey coordinators. So there's a lot of things that we can do on a granular level, including, just again, having conversations, agitating for better medical coverage, and more providers. There's a huge gulf in the need for medical care, mental health care, and the number of providers. So it starts with just, again, looking at the person as a human being and then expanding that to giving them those very basic things that they need.
And what about for people that have a close family member that is the one dealing with mental illness and severe mental illness, as we were also just talking about before the session started, it's very insidious. It impacts not only that person, but it takes a toll on a family unit, it takes a toll on friends.
Yes.
So if we know someone who is close to someone else, maybe that person isn't dealing with mental illness themselves, or severe mental illness, but they are very close to someone who is, how can we all be a little bit more compassionate to that person as they're going through that journey with the person suffering?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're 100% right. It reverberates, for every one person who is suffering from a serious mental illness. The family's going through the ropes. It's very tense at home. Just those people need compassion as well. And yeah, just to acknowledge. So there are so many good now, thank God, programs that didn't exist back in the day when we were growing up. Chief among them is NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they provide support groups. So they do education classes, they're excellent, and family support groups. And I highly recommend those for anybody who has a family member who is so ill that they can't attend to their own needs, they can't hold a job, they can't live independently. And find ways to give yourself some balance and some boundaries and some space. You need that, when you're living with somebody who is just really can't get out of bed in the morning. That doesn't mean that you can't get out of bed, and that you should get out of bed, and you should also find ways in your own life to fill up your cup, to find ways to be joyful and to balance your own life. And you're going to need that, that expression about putting the mask over your own nose and mouth before you put it on a little kid in an airplane. That's true, too, of living with somebody with serious mental illness. You really need to care for yourself and set your own boundaries.
Kind of back to how we can continue dealing with this issue sort of in the context of work. Again, it's a business conference, so I want to relate it back. I don't know if we have any employers in the room. Certainly we have lots of employees. But I was hoping that you could maybe share the example of your brother Jake.
Sure.
And how his relationship with his employer. I mean, this is a very kind of stellar example of what of the lengths an employer could go for someone who is experiencing some mental illness. But I think it's also just so heartwarming. So I'd love you to share.
Yeah, great, Meredith. Thank you for that. So my older brother Jake lives in a group home in Skokie, Illinois. So Jake is a love bug. He's so his illness is anxiety, like I would say crippling anxiety, and he's also he's on the spectrum. So he's has an inability to really form a plan. Like let's say you say, okay, you're cooking dinner tonight. That would pretty much freeze him up for the whole day. You'd be freaked out with that because he wouldn't be able to kind of figure out how to go to the grocery store and what to get. He's a super intelligent guy. His IQ is like sky high, and he can tell you like the most arcane facts about like motorcycle helmet laws in Montana, but then the guy can't like whip up some mac and cheese. So anyway, so he lives in a group home. And when my dad died about 11 years ago or 12 years ago, I wrote a story for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel about what it's like when there are adults in the family, when the parents die and the adult children are left to kind of figure out what do you do with a sibling who has special needs. And the story got a lot of attention, including a guy by the name of Jim Everly. So Jim was in Jake's class at St. Francis Xavier Grade School in Wilmette, Illinois, back in the 1960s. And he was like a playground bully. And he used to pick on Jake. So much so that Jake actually ended up transferring to the public school. And anyway, Jim, now fast forward, is a guy in his now like late 50s or early 60s, reads this story, and he's so guilty. He feels so badly about how mean he had been to Jake all those years earlier. And so he called him up and invited him to lunch. And he said to him, you know, Jake, I'm just so sorry for being such a jerk. What can I do for you? And Jake said, well, I could use a job. So he hired him. This is so many years ago. And Jim owns an electrical supply company. So Jake is their inventory manager because he's awesome at certain tasks, and that's one of them. And so Jim is like, he'll text me if he sees that Jake is kind of not looking very well or not feeling very well. And during COVID, the group home agreed that they couldn't they couldn't leave the property. And so for a year, Jake was in his room and they would bring meals to the door. It just breaks my heart to think about that. And then finally things started to kind of ease up, but they still maintained that he couldn't go to work. Well, Jim thought that this was ridiculous, and he launched this campaign to get Jake back to work. And he did a little video of all the employees at the electrical supply company holding up a sign saying, "We need you, Jake." Anyway, it was so sweet, and he presented it to the board of the group home, and they gave him a special permission, and Jake was allowed to resume work. Actually, they're coming up next week. They're coming up to Milwaukee, Jake and Jim, and Jim's wife, and we're all going to go out to dinner. So it's just an awesome story. And my own experience, you know, so I mentioned my editor, George Stanley, who was the editor then of the Journal Sentinel. And George had lost one of his best friends to suicide his senior year. I guess we were a freshman in college. And he was heartbroken, he's been heartbroken his whole life about that. And he knew about my family's circumstance, and he knew that that was like an area that I just really felt like I needed to cover. So he saw the pain that I was living with and found a way for us both to kind of turn that into something of value for the company, you know. So I was able to write all those stories and go on this tear about, you know, the need for better mental health care. And that was good for the Journal Sentinel as a company, too, to have those stories and to be kind of an outlier. I believe at one time I was the only reporter in the country that was dedicated to only writing about mental illness. So now a lot of newspapers, the Seattle Times and the New York Times, a lot of those organizations have dedicated mental health reporters, but they didn't back then. So employers have a great opportunity to, you know, both find ways to foster mental health education, because the reality is your employees are living with someplace in their life, maybe not to the extreme example of the Kissinger family, but there are issues in your workforce of either your own employees suffering with their mental health or their family members are. And you're just going to be, it's the right thing to do, you know, ethically, but it's also a good business plan to be a compassionate employer. And then on the flip side, employees, you know, I get asked all the time, you know, should I identify on my resume that I have a mental illness or whatever? Not necessarily, but I don't think it should be a secret either. And so I think employees should feel okay to ask their boss, you know, if you're having a hard time and you need a break. You would do that if you had COVID, or you would do that if you had your appendix out. So I think transparency and leveling the playing field for what mental illness is and to any other illness. And just a quick footnote on that. So, you know, it was so long believed that people were just kind of faking mental illness to get out of work or whatever. You know, maybe that happens here and there, but I think for every one person that does that, there's probably 100 or maybe 1,000 that are squelching the pain that they're going through and not really finding ways to get healthy.
It's a great reminder. Are there any questions from the audience at this time? I wanted to make sure, we have a few minutes left here, and I wanted to make sure if there were any questions, we could take them. Yes?
Can you talk about the title of your book?
Sure. So the title is While You're Out. It's kind of a joke. So it's kind of a dark joke. I mean, I'm Irish, right? So we're dark humor. So when I was a freshman in college, I came back from the dorm after my intro to poli-sci class. And in the old days, before cell phones, you know, there was the lady at the front desk who took phone messages and those little pink slips while you were out. And mine just said 2 words, Grandma died. Like, Grandma? So I ran down the hall, it got to the payphone, called my mom. I'm like, Grandma died? And she's like, oh yeah, sorry, I had so many people to call. And so she's like, the funeral's Wednesday, get a dress and come home. Anyway, so, I mean, my grandma had lived a full, rich life, and we mourned her passing. I didn't expect my mother to call, a grief counselor, but she could have been a little, taken a little more time with that message. So it was meant to reflect how quickly we dispatch, really talking about the things that we need to talk about in a more sustained way. And it takes on even deeper meaning when you learn about the circumstances of the days that my sister and my brother died. And the implicit, the even more kind of macro message is that we all need to be in for one another. We can't be out, we have to pay attention. Yeah.
Are you in the works of writing another book?
Oh my God, I hate that question. No! This is about killing me to write this. No, actually, I should never say no to anything because this year has been so amazing for me. It has been rich in every way. I feel like every day is Christmas. Like that I get to talk about this with total strangers who are my immediate friends because we share, a passion for learning about, how to help people that we love. And so maybe someday, I don't see it right away, but I've had just very rich, deep conversations. I got an email last week from a guy. I didn't know this guy. I'd never met him. And he had read my book, and he knew my brother Danny. And he was writing to tell me about what a great guy Danny was and how funny and how he remembers going over to his apartment and seeing a picture, that Danny kept a picture of us all on his mantle. And anyway, it was so tender and sweet. I got another email from a woman who was my sister Nancy's roommate in college. And she had no idea. She just bought the book and opened it up, and there's Nancy's picture, So I'm having these very rich conversations. So maybe something will come out of that.
Yeah, there's a sequel right there.
Okay. Thank you for that suggestion.
Yes, Meg, to that point, do you have any tips when you're in these situations where there is something to talk about or to share? Because you and I were talking earlier about the power of vulnerability. Any brief tips to touch on this stuff to make the conversation a little bit more open and fluid?
How to be vulnerable? Yeah.
With people and when you
Yeah.
share.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, Mo. I think it's I needed to be where I am now before I could write this book. My kids used to joke, tease me all the time, Mom, you always say you're going to write a book, and you're never going to write this book. And so it took me a long, long, long time. But I think I needed to be in a place where I was comfortable with who I am and old enough and had enough, experience. But how to be vulnerable is a great art, a great gift. And I think it's just having faith in yourself and faith in the message that you're trying to get across. So, as I said at the beginning, everybody here, I know if I talked to each one of you individually, I would find some amazing story that is worthy of your own book. But to be vulnerable, I think just means to open yourself up and be honest. So I think being a newspaper reporter, first of all, I tried to write this book as a fiction for so many years. I was terrible at it. First of all, I don't have that kind of brain where I can make stuff up. Like, I had the family, like, there was the protagonist was somebody named Maggie, and her little sister was Patsy, that's my sister Patty, and then, like, the rascally little brother was Will, which is my brother Billy. So it was like, no, I can't do it. But anyway, and I think it's because I needed to be married to the facts. So what I did in putting this book together was I got the police records of the days that they died. I got the court files from my brother Danny's criminal case. I interviewed people. I tracked down old teachers and old neighbors, and it was a procedural. It was like how I would write an investigative piece for the newspaper, but it meant being truthful. And that's what being vulnerable is. Being vulnerable really starts with being truthful and not ashamed too. So that is the facts. These are what happened, and I'm going to tell it to you. I'm going to tell you the truth about it, and the truth is going to be painful for me to tell you, and it might be painful for you to hear. But it's important for me to tell you that, and it's important for me to lay myself bare and to bear witness. And you take that from that what you can.
Well, Meg, thank you so much for bearing witness today. This was a wonderful discussion, and I think we have to end it there.
Look, your dad wants to say something.
Kate and I listened to the book. If you've got a lot of time in the car, it's also on audio. Meg did a great recording. And there are some very funny parts. Like, what's the name of your bird?
Our bird was named Flip. And it took us a long time to figure out, my mother, a long time to figure out that was kind of a naughty name for a bird. It's been a joy to be with you, and I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.